The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Noah lay pale and motionless on the hospital bed, his breathing shallow and uneven, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only fragile thread tethering him to life. The sterile air around him carried a strange stillness, as though time itself had stopped inside that room. Nurses moved briskly, whispering in restrained urgency, while the doctor's brow furrowed deeper with every passing second. The test results were inconclusive, the transfusion was delayed, and the hospital's blood bank was running out of compatible matches. The doctor turned toward Sharon and Nick, his voice breaking the silence with the kind of cold authority that made hearts freeze. "We need to identify his biological parents immediately," he said. "His life depends on it." Nick, stunned and desperate, insisted that his blood type had always matched Noah's. It should have worked, it always had. But this time, the doctor's expression hardened as he held up the test results. The DNA markers didn't align. The test didn't just reject Nick's compatibility, it denied him as Noah's father altogether. It was a truth that sliced through decades of love, memory, and identity. Nick stared at the report, his hands trembling, unable to comprehend how something so foundational could suddenly be stripped away. Sharon, standing beside him, could barely breathe. The world blurred at the edges as shame and fear began to suffocate her. She tried to steady herself against the wall, but her body betrayed her, trembling from the weight of a secret she had buried long ago, one she thought would never see the light of day. The doctor asked again, sharper this time, who are his real parents? "We need immediate blood donors. Tell me now, Mrs. Newman, or he won't survive the next few hours." Sharon's lips quivered, her eyes darting to Nick, to the unconscious form of her son, and back to the ground. Her silence spoke louder than words. Nick's disbelief gave way to fury. A cold, disorienting anger mixed with heartbreak. "What are you not telling me?" he demanded, but even before she spoke, the dread in her eyes told him the answer. The truth was no longer a choice, it was a storm breaking through her restraint. The truth that had haunted her for years now came crashing down in the most merciless way. Sharon's tears spilled as her voice cracked under the confession. "It's Adam," she whispered, almost inaudible, yet it hit Nick like a thunderclap. Adam, the brother he had spent half his life hating, the man who had stolen and lied and destroyed, the one person he never imagined being tied to by blood. The doctor froze, the nurses exchanged glances, and Nick felt his chest tighten with disbelief so sharp it bordered on physical pain. The weight of betrayal pressed down on everyone in the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sharon collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly, her mind replaying every reckless choice, every night she had convinced herself the lie would protect them all. She had thought the truth would die with her, that Noah would never have to bear the burden of knowing who truly gave him life. But fate, cruel and precise, had chosen this moment to unearth it, a hospital room, a blood transfusion, and a crisis that forced the past to resurface. Nick left the room, numb and staggering, his world imploding in slow motion. He couldn't process that his son, the boy he had raised, loved, and fought for, might belong to Adam, his own brother. The irony of it was unbearable. Meanwhile, Sharon sat trembling in the corner as the doctor began making calls to locate Adam. She knew what would happen next, the tests, the confrontation, the judgment in everyone's eyes. But above all, she feared losing Noah. That was the only thing that mattered now. Hours later, in Los Angeles, Adam was at his apartment reviewing business emails when his phone rang. It was a number from Genoa City, and his first thought was that it had to do with Newman Enterprises. When he picked up, the doctor's voice on the other end was urgent, almost pleading. "Mr. Newman, your son is in critical condition. We need you to come immediately for a DNA match and potential blood transfusion." Adam's face went pale. "My what?" The words didn't make sense. For all his sins, all the schemes and manipulations, he had no idea that he could be someone's father, especially not Noah. The doctor repeated the information slowly, carefully, explaining that Sharon had named him as the biological father. At first Adam thought it was a cruel mistake, a mix-up, maybe even some elaborate punishment by fate. But something in the tone of the doctor's voice told him this wasn't a misunderstanding. Within the hour, Adam was on a flight to Los Angeles, his mind spiraling through disbelief, guilt, and confusion. As he sat staring out the window, flashes of his past with Sharon returned, the stolen glances, the mistakes, the regrets buried under years of denial. He had tried to forget those moments, to rewrite them as illusions of a damaged man searching for love in the wrong places. But now, confronted with this sudden revelation, every memory felt like a prophecy he had ignored. When Adam arrived at the hospital, the tension was palpable. Nick was standing by the window, rigid and silent, his eyes bloodshot from a mix of exhaustion and fury. Sharon looked broken, her face pale, her soul drained. The air between the three of them felt like shattered glass, sharp, cold, and dangerous to touch. The doctor ushered Adam in, took his blood sample, and within minutes, the results confirmed it: Adam was a perfect match. The truth was undeniable. The silence that followed was unbearable. Adam looked at Noah's fragile body, connected to machines, pale against the sheets, and something inside him cracked. He had never asked for this. Never wanted to be responsible for another life, especially one born of betrayal. Yet here he was, the only one who could save him. Without hesitation, Adam agreed to the transfusion. As the blood began to flow, a quiet symbolism filled the room, the blood of one brother's betrayal now giving life to the son raised by another. It was an image too poetic, too painful to comprehend. Sharon watched, torn between gratitude and devastation, while Nick could barely look at either of them. He wanted to scream, to walk away, to pretend this wasn't real, but he couldn't abandon Noah. Not now. As the transfusion continued, the monitors began to stabilize. Noah's heartbeat grew stronger, his breathing steadier. Relief washed over the room, but it was tainted by the fractures that could never be mended. For Sharon, this was the price of silence, the years of pretending, the lies she had told herself about love, loyalty, and protection. For Nick, it was the shattering of a father's identity, the cruel reminder that biology can destroy decades of unconditional devotion. For Adam, it was a cruel redemption, saving a life that existed because of his own weakness, his own selfishness. Later that night, as the doctors confirmed Noah's recovery was steady, Sharon sat alone in the hospital chapel, staring at the flickering candles. The past replayed endlessly in her mind, the night of the affair, the guilt she buried, the years of pretending Noah was Nick's child. She had wanted to protect her son from the chaos of the Newman rivalry, but instead, she had made him a product of its darkest secret. The chapel felt suffocating, filled with echoes of her own shame. Meanwhile, Nick stood outside the ICU, staring at Adam through the glass. There were no words left. No accusations, no apologies, just an empty chasm between two brothers now bound by blood in the cruelest way imaginable. Nick knew he would never see Noah the same again. Every memory, every birthday, every proud moment now carried an invisible shadow. Yet even in his anger, a small part of him knew that love couldn't be erased by DNA. He had been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph. He was still Noah's father in every way that mattered, but it didn't make the betrayal any less devastating. Adam left the hospital hours later, walking into the cold night air with a hollow expression. He had done the right thing, but it felt like punishment more than redemption. Saving Noah's life meant confronting the wreckage of his own, the lies, the grudges, the pain he had inflicted on everyone he touched. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Sharon finally walked back into Noah's room. His color had returned slightly, his breathing calm and steady. She touched his hand gently, tears slipping down her face as she whispered apologies he couldn't yet hear. She knew the road ahead would be long, rebuilding trust, facing Nick, explaining the truth to Noah when he woke. But at least he was alive. That was the only solace left in the wreckage of her choices. Back in Genoa City, the Newman legacy was about to fracture once again. Word would spread, lines would be drawn, and the family would be forced to face yet another scandal rooted in betrayal and secrecy. For now, though, inside that dimly lit hospital room, all that mattered was the rhythmic sound of a steady heartbeat, the fragile proof that even from lies, life could still be saved, and that sometimes the greatest punishments are not death or loss, but the truth finally coming to light. The results were in. The DNA test left no room for doubt, no gray area, no comforting margin of error to soften the blow. Adam was Noah's biological father. The doctor's voice echoed through the room like a death sentence, calm but devastating, as he confirmed the result in a clinical monotone that felt cruelly detached from the emotional carnage it unleashed. Nick's body went rigid, his jaw tightening as his eyes burned with disbelief. It couldn't be true. It couldn't happen again. Yet, there it was, the same twisted pattern that seemed to haunt his life like a curse with Adam's name carved into it. Why was it always him? Why did every fragile piece of happiness Nick built end up bleeding in Adam's shadow? Sharon's face turned white as marble, her hands trembling, her lips parted but speechless, because the truth had finally solidified into something she could no longer deny or rationalize. Nick's heart raced with a fury he hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes not just from betrayal, but from exhaustion, the exhaustion of being replaced, again and again, by the same man who wore his blood but none of his integrity. He could almost hear the cruel voice of fate mocking him, Christian. Connor. And now Noah. 3 boys. 3 losses. 3 pieces of his soul stolen by his own brother. He staggered backward, pressing a hand to his forehead as though he could erase the truth by sheer force of denial. Sharon tried to speak, to explain, but her words tangled into silence. What could she possibly say? How could she justify this? How could she tell him that while he had been loving her, trusting her, raising their son, she had been living a lie, one that had now reached across decades and generations to destroy everything they had built? The memory of Christian flashed through Nick's mind, the night he learned that the boy he thought was his son was actually Adam's. The betrayal had nearly broken him then, but he had survived it by convincing himself that fate couldn't be so cruel twice. Then came Connor, another painful reminder that Adam's shadow never really left his life, only waited for the next chance to swallow it whole. And now Noah, his firstborn, his pride, his one constant, was revealed to be another echo of Adam's sins and Sharon's deceit. It was too much. Adam stood frozen, still in shock himself, but his guilt was undeniable. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't schemed for it this time, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. He could feel Nick's hatred radiating from across the room, like heat from a wildfire. There was no apology that could erase this, no gesture that could make it right. The truth had drawn blood again, and this time the wound cut too deep to ever heal. Nick turned toward Sharon, his voice trembling with restrained rage, each word sharp enough to pierce through her already breaking heart. Why? That was all he could manage, but that one word carried everything, the betrayal, the confusion, the love, and the disbelief. Sharon's tears fell in silence as her shoulders shook. She had no justification that wouldn't sound cruel, no excuse that wouldn't make her seem selfish. The truth was she didn't know why. She had been lost back then, torn, fragile, looking for comfort, and she had turned to the one person she should have avoided. It had been a mistake that grew into a lie, and that lie had grown into a family. As Nick stood there, breathing heavily, he realized this wasn't just about the night Sharon betrayed him, it was about every pattern she had repeated for years. The endless pull between 2 brothers, the way she drifted between them like a ghost that never chose a side. She had destroyed them both and convinced herself she was saving them. He had been her stability, her safe harbor. Adam had been her temptation, her darkness, her danger. And somehow, she had managed to make both men orbit her chaos. Nick's voice cracked as he spoke again, this time to himself, almost whispering. You did it again, Sharon. You chose him over me. You always do. She shook her head, sobbing, but the words were knives that she couldn't deflect. The doctor excused himself quietly, leaving them to the storm. The silence that followed was deafening. Nick's chest rose and fell as anger finally overtook grief. "Do you even know what you've done?" he said, his tone trembling. "You've let him take everything from me. Every son I've ever loved, every piece of my family. First Christian. Then Connor. And now Noah. 3 sons, all mine in my heart, but his by blood. You made me live this nightmare again." His voice cracked with a rawness that made Sharon flinch. She tried to speak, to tell him it wasn't planned, that she hadn't known for sure, that she thought Noah was his, that it was only one reckless night after months of heartbreak, but the words collapsed before reaching her lips. Nick wouldn't have heard them anyway. His mind was already spiraling, replaying the years of shared laughter, Christmas mornings, family dinners, the memories of Noah calling him Dad, never knowing the truth that would now redefine everything. Adam finally found his voice, low and trembling, the sound of a man who hated himself as much as the world hated him. "Nick, I swear I didn't know," he said, but it came out hollow. Nick's eyes snapped toward him, blazing. "You never do you?" he spat. "You just destroy and walk away." The words hit Adam harder than any punch. He had no defense. He couldn't deny the trail of destruction that followed him through life, the broken families, the endless rivalries, the sons that carried his blood but not his love. Sharon buried her face in her hands, realizing she had turned 2 brothers into lifelong enemies for the sake of one mistake she could never undo. Later, when the initial explosion of anger gave way to cold silence, Nick found himself alone in the hospital corridor, staring out through the glass at Noah's room. His son, his boy, lay there, alive because of Adam's blood. The irony was unbearable. He wanted to feel grateful, but all he could feel was robbed. The family he built had been rewritten by biology, and it was Adam's name stamped on it once again. He thought of Faith, of Summer, of all the years he had spent trying to keep his family together, and now all of it felt like a cruel illusion. He wasn't sure who he hated more, Adam for always being there to ruin everything, or Sharon for always letting him. Inside the ICU, Adam sat by Noah's bed after the transfusion, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. He didn't know what to feel, pride, guilt, horror, or regret. The blood that had once been a curse in his veins was now sustaining another life, and for once, he couldn't use money or power to fix what had been broken. He looked at Noah and saw the face of a boy who had never known the truth, who had looked up to Nick all his life. And Adam knew that when Noah woke, nothing would ever be the same. He thought about Connor, about the pain he had caused Chelsea, about Christian, and how Nick had raised him better than Adam ever could. Now it was happening again, the same cruel symmetry repeating itself. That night, Sharon sat in the hospital chapel again, trying to pray but unable to form words. She was haunted by the weight of her own duplicity. She had told herself for years that the affair with Adam had been meaningless, a lapse, a wound in time she could seal away forever. But now she saw the truth, it hadn't been meaningless. It had consequences, living, breathing, bleeding consequences. She thought about the night she slept with both Adam and Nick within the same narrow window of time, desperate for comfort after another fight, another moment of weakness. She had justified it as emotional confusion, but the truth was darker. She had loved them both in different ways, and that love had destroyed them. By morning, the tension inside the hospital had spread like wildfire. News of the DNA revelation leaked quickly, whispered among nurses, hinted at by reporters circling the Newman name like vultures. The family was in damage control. Victor, upon hearing the truth, was furious. Not just at Sharon, but at fate itself. Once again, his sons had dragged the Newman legacy through scandal and shame. He called both men to the ranch, demanding explanations, but the silence that met him said everything. Adam avoided his father's gaze, while Nick's eyes were full of hatred that no apology could erase. Victor had seen many wars in his family, but this one cut deeper. It wasn't about money or business, it was about blood, about identity, about the curse that seemed to define his lineage. In the following days, as Noah's condition improved, he began to regain fragments of consciousness. Sharon stayed by his side constantly, while Nick stood at a distance, unable to face the boy who no longer felt like his own. When Noah finally opened his eyes and asked what had happened, Sharon hesitated. She couldn't tell him, not yet. How do you tell a son that the man he's called dad his entire life is not his father, but his uncle? How do you undo years of love and loyalty with a single truth? Yet, she knew the day was coming. Secrets in Genoa City never stayed buried for long. For now, the damage was done. Nick walked out of the hospital without a word, the sun glaring off the glass as though mocking him for ever believing he could escape his brother's shadow. Adam remained inside, watching Sharon crumble under the weight of her own decisions. He didn't gloat, didn't argue, didn't justify. He simply sat there, knowing that once again he had won nothing. His blood might have saved Noah, but it had damned them all. And somewhere deep inside both men, the same thought burned, that maybe this rivalry between brothers had never really been about business or pride or love. Maybe it was destiny, an endless cycle that Sharon had reignited with her choices, a curse written in the bloodline of the Newman family. But this time, the war wouldn't be fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. It would be fought in the wreckage of their hearts, in the space between fatherhood and betrayal, where love had become indistinguishable from hate.